Thank you so much, Kathleen and Nate. Big thank you to Kaki Hockersmith and Stephanie Street for all their organization. And a thank you to Congressman Hill. That was a wonderful opening to what we're going to be talking about all day. In 1801, less than a month into his presidency, President Thomas Jefferson heard a rumor that turned out to be true. The rumor was that the Spanish king had given Louisiana back to France. This was bad news. If you were here last night, you saw the map I put up of the Spanish claim to North America after the Revolution. It was basically everything west of the Appalachians in North America. The United States had spent all the years, the almost 2 decades since the Revolution, trying to get Spain to give up those claims and to give the United States the lands west of the Appalachian, the Trans-Appalachian West, and to give farmers in the West access to the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans, because lands in Tennessee and Kentucky, eventually Alabama and Mississippi, would be worth nothing if people couldn't get their crops to the Mississippi and out into the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. Spain had finally agreed in 1795 in Pinckney's Treaty, or the Treaty of San Lorenzo, to give much of that land to the United States, or in the United States' view, to recognize that it belonged to the United States. And that treaty also gave farmers in the United States access to the Mississippi and New Orleans. Now, it was just 5 years later, 5 years after that treaty, more than a third of American exports were going down the Mississippi River and out New Orleans. And suddenly it was all in jeopardy because of the other man on the screen, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had thus far been victorious in France and in Europe. He now had as one of his many goals to reverse the 7 Years' War, the war that France had lost to England, and to win back North America for the French Empire. Jefferson and his Secretary of State, James Monroe, instructed Robert Livingston, who was the U.S. Minister to France, to try to get France to agree to the same terms that Spain had agreed to in Pinckney's Treaty, to preserve access for American farmers to the Mississippi and New Orleans. And to ask if there was any chance France was interested in unloading some of this. New Orleans would be wonderful, or maybe another port along the Gulf, Pensacola or Mobile. But Napoleon's administration ignored this nobody from, frankly, a nobody country. And in 1802, Napoleon prepared to truly colonize North America, to send troops back to Louisiana, this place that he'd gotten Spain to give back to him. Spain also closed New Orleans to American shipping in 1802, in October of 1802, which confirmed all the fears that Jefferson and other Americans had, that this was the way things were going, and it was not good. 31,000 troops sailed from France. As we talked about yesterday, they stopped in Haiti to try to put down the slave rebellion. They thoroughly failed. The Haitian Revolution did them in. 27,000 of those 31,000 troops died in Haiti. And in the meantime, Britain declared war on France and ended the sort of short-lived peace in Europe. Napoleon's thinking changes at this point, of course, right? If there's some chance in this coming war against Britain that he may lose New Orleans and the Gulf Coast to Britain, it had happened before in the 7 Years' War, the better situation would be for that to belong to the United States. The United States was a weak country in the very beginning of the 19th century, was still an ally of France, and having somebody you could push around owning New Orleans and the Gulf would be better than losing it to Britain. So in early 1803, French Foreign Minister Talleyrand hinted to Livingston that he was ready to make a deal. Livingston wrote to Jefferson, "This may be our chance." And Jefferson sent James Monroe with instructions to spend up to $10 million to buy New Orleans or the Floridas, New Orleans, it sounds strange that they might think they could split off New Orleans from Louisiana, but technically New Orleans is east of the Mississippi. It's kind of a mess down there in the Delta, but it's definitely not west of the Mississippi. And the instructions said, if you can't get Napoleon to sell, and you can't get him to agree to Pinckney's treaty, that the U.S. can have access to the Mississippi and New Orleans, then your next stop is London. And go to London and sign a defensive pact with Britain. Okay. So when the French suggested 15 million, a little higher price, but for all of Louisiana, Livingston and Monroe said, okay. The letter that they wrote back to Jefferson is a model of what you do when you say, I have good news, really, I do, but you're not really sure your reader is going to think it's good news. Let me read you a little bit of it. So this is Livingston and Monroe writing to Jefferson in May. We have the pleasure to transmit to you a treaty which we have concluded with the French Republic for the purchase and cession of Louisiana. An acquisition of so great an extent was, we well know, not contemplated by our appointment, but we are persuaded that the circumstances and considerations which induced us to make it will justify us in the measure to our government and country. We hope this was okay. Right? We spent $5 million more than you said, and we got a totally different thing from what you wanted, but we hope it'll be okay. Jefferson was thrilled. But was it legal? Should there be a constitutional amendment? Jefferson actually drafted a constitutional amendment, worrying that he maybe didn't have the power to do this. But the problem with a constitutional amendment, of course, is not only do you have to get it through Congress, you have to get it ratified, and he could lose. So the cabinet decided, we're going to call it a treaty, and treaties are covered under the Constitution already. The president has the power to negotiate a treaty, and it has to be ratified by the Senate, of course. The New England delegation was against it. All but one of the members of the senators from New England voted against the treaty. But Jefferson had the majority in Congress. Senate approved it and approved a bond to pay for it. So now, on paper, some of which we have right here, on paper, the vast area from the Mississippi River to the Rockies was now part of the United States. But in fact, in the 3 centuries that France and Spain had claimed this region, they had never really colonized it. And they really had never even understood it. I remember when I was first learning about Lewis and Clark and Hunter Dunbar, I thought, why didn't they just ask the French in Spanish? I figured, okay, maybe they have different sort of measurements they want than what Indian knowledge would tell them. But surely the French and Spanish knew. But in fact, those same questions that we talk about Jefferson not knowing, how far was it to the Pacific? How exactly do you get there? What's in between? The French and Spanish didn't know either. There had been expeditions across over and over since the early 1500s, but mostly they got lost and often got killed. So this place gave, of course, the city of New Orleans and a few posts along the Mississippi and close tributaries, but not much else in terms of a colony. This region was controlled and populated by American Indian nations, tens of thousands of individual American Indians and hundreds, at least, of individual nations. There was a second constitutional problem, how to incorporate the people. Now, the first is, can you even bring this land in? The second is, what do you do with the people who actually live there? The treaty with France, the treaty that Livingston and Monroe had made with France, said, the United States will abide by French and Spanish agreements with Indians, and that was one of the terms of the treaty. And another was that Louisiana's colonists would become full citizens of the United States. Now, the Constitution provides for naturalizing individual citizens, a process for becoming a citizen if you're an immigrant. But it doesn't provide for naturalizing thousands of people in one swoop. Vice President Aaron Burr wrote, "Are they citizens of the United States, or can Congress make them such?" And a lot of people's answer, and Burr thought maybe, maybe not without a constitutional amendment. Maybe there's not a legal way to do this yet. And even a constitutional amendment wouldn't solve two more problems. One was when you immigrate to the United States and you naturalize, you choose American citizenship. Were they going to hold a referendum in Louisiana? What if they voted no? Like, we're already spending $15 million on this. What if St. Louis voted yes and Arkansas Post voted no? There was not going to be a referendum to ask Louisianans if they wanted to be part of the United States. But if you don't ask them, if you make them citizens of the United States, are you violating the claim to universal right of self-determination that the United States is built on, that Jefferson had written a very important document about? And that's only the first problem. The second problem, these were colonists who not only had never lived under a republic, but in the eyes of Americans, had never lived under a system of British liberties, where if you lived in the British colony of Virginia, you got to vote for their House of Burgesses, right? You didn't get a vote in Parliament. That was part of one of the reasons for the Revolution. But you did have local representatives. If you lived in a New England town, you got to vote for your town government and the colony government. One congressman called the people of Louisiana a Gallo-Hispano-Indian omnium gatherum of savages and adventurers. He did not think they were worthy of American citizenship. The solution would be, for Louisiana's white colonists, the territorial system, a system by which gradually a group of people could become naturalized. Now, as Dr. Mitchell told us yesterday, there was some expectation, at least in New Orleans, that Black Louisianans would be part of citizenship, that free people of color could become citizens as well, as they transitioned to a very different style of government than they had had as a colony. But they were left out of this. The territorial system was created just for white men. In the short run, the Louisiana Purchase, people who lived in Louisiana Purchase, would have no representation in Congress. They would have no local officials that they voted for. But in the long run, they could form states that would be full states with all the privileges of states within the Union. Now, Louisiana's colonists believed that making them territories, sort of this training period, violated the treaty, that wasn't what the treaty with France said, that the treaty said they were supposed to be full citizens immediately. One petition from Louisiana declared that Louisianans were persuaded that a free people, so the United States, who they're addressing in the petition, persuaded that a free people would acquire territory only for the purpose of extending the blessings of freedom, that an enlightened nation would never destroy those principles on which its government was founded, and that their representatives would surely disdain to become the instruments of oppression. Like, we're sure you want us to be full citizens if you're going to have us at all. But the people who already lived in the Louisiana Territory were not the reason for the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson saw the Louisiana Purchase as the ideal opportunity to forward two goals, neither of which had to do with citizens of Louisiana. One was expanding farms, as I talked about last night, expanding farms for white Americans, his empire of liberty. That white Americans could move west and continue being a spread out agrarian nation into the future, even as their population grew. But his other goal, and what he also believed, was that the Louisiana Purchase was good news for Indians. As Dr. Bolton mentioned last night, Jefferson had a civilization plan for Indians. He wanted Indians to change their lives. Jefferson believed that Indians who lived within the boundaries of the United States, so before the Louisiana Purchase, that they were in trouble. He hadn't gone out to talk to them and ask them what they thought, but he had come to this conclusion, that game on their lands was declining, hunting was becoming less possible, that they were having trouble feeding and clothing themselves as a result. Daily, Jefferson wrote, Indians suffered violence from white Americans who wanted their land. And to Jefferson, the United States had a moral obligation to prevent the Indians' imminent extinction. Now, this is a recurring myth in colonial and American history that Indians are just on the verge of dying off. Now, there are 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States today. American Indians have not died off, either as nations or as individual people. But it keeps coming up in American history. And Jefferson was sure this was going to happen if something didn't change. And the change was the civilization policy. He would send U.S. agents and missionaries to teach Indians how to support themselves with agriculture rather than hunting. And it's a very neat plan. If they don't hunt anymore, they don't need as much land, right? They'll farm instead of hunt. There's this extra land, and who can it go to? It can go to white farmers, in what Jefferson called a coincidence of interest. How lucky, it'll be good for everybody. Now, there's some truth to his diagnosis, at least in the East. Game is declining by this point. There certainly is pressure from white farmers. But it's not at all true in the Louisiana Purchase. The Indians in this region, the Quapaws and the Osage and others who lived here, they farmed already, just like Indians in the East also farmed. Women did the farming in most of these societies, which is why white Americans tended not to notice it, to imagine that they only hunted instead of farmed. Indians here lived in permanent towns. They fed and clothed themselves very well. And their hunting was mostly producing furs and skins for the global economy, for the global trade in leather. Jefferson's views of Indians is not incidental to the history of the Louisiana Purchase. It's central to it. He advocated a gradual westward expansion. He saw Louisiana was nearly 1,000 miles from the centers of U.S. population. And remember, this is only a couple decades into this experiment of the American Republic. Jefferson was worried that if they spread too far too fast, the bonds of the Union would break. If they got too far from where they came from. And in fact, there were hundreds of Americans by this point who actually had denounced their American citizenship and gone west to live under Spanish rule because it worked better for their families, their economic interests. So his idea was, don't move so fast, white farmers. What we'll do first is send Indians there. This is before forced removal, but somewhat voluntary removal. Indians in the East who are under all these pressures, they move west first. Once they get to Louisiana, Louisiana will be a training ground for civilization for them. Federal agents and missionaries will be there. They'll teach these Indians who moved there and Indians who've been living there already how to farm and worship like white Americans. Gradually, over the next few generations, he thinks, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren of white Americans can move west, and by the time they get there, this process will have happened where Indians have learned to farm and they need less and less land, and there will be land for white Americans. Now, of course, many Native Americans would point out in the coming years that this plan was considerably more advantageous to Anglo-Americans who wanted land than to Indians who were supposed to give up their lands and their cultures. So I'm going to talk for a while here about some of the history and responses of the Osage, the Quapaws, and then also the Cherokees who moved west. During the 18th century, the Osage Indians controlled extensive lands across Louisiana by peacefully trading with some people, including the French and Spanish, and threatening, robbing, and occasionally killing uninvited white and Indian intruders. And as they expanded, some of them came down from where they originally were on the Mississippi River and established a presence on the Arkansas River where it says Arkansas Osage, and were beginning to move down south against the Caddos and the Wichitas as well. U.S. observers who came here in the years right after the Louisiana Purchase considered the Arkansas Osage the most uncivilized people in the region, the people most in need of the civilization program. Traveler William Dunbar said that the Osage robbed and frequently scalped everybody they encountered. And Dunbar even said, and I think this is probably true, even other Indians called the Osage a barbarous, uncivilized race. So that's his vocabulary, right? But it is true that other Indians thought they were expansionist and warlike. Anglo-Americans interpreted Osage intimidation not as a strategy that arguably wasn't all that different from a European colonial or white American expansionist strategy, but instead as a sign that the Osage were uncivilized. You can imagine how the Osage responded when American officials told them they needed to change their lives, right? They thought, this has been pretty successful for us. We are the dominant people here. You need to figure that out. They refused to accept the American model of themselves as savages in need of training and civilization. They said, how the Osage live are our business, like how we run our economy, how we run our politics, don't have anything to do with you. In 1806, one Arkansas Osage chief explained that the United States should see the Osage as military allies. You should want us on your side, not as people who needed a lesson in farming. This chief pointed to the marks of the tomahawk in many places, which I received in defense of white people. What you need to know about me is my status as a warrior, the way I can help you this way. To the Osage, they were a sovereign people negotiating with another nation. And at first, in these early years of the Louisiana Purchase, the United States had to respect the Osage view of themselves and their relationship. The Osage had about 1,000 men fighting between the Missouri River and the Arkansas River. In contrast, the United States had fewer than 2,000 troops scattered over all the lands west of the Appalachians, so not just the Louisiana Purchase, but everything west of the Appalachians. The numbers change over time, but basically about 16 men were stationed to Arkansas Post. Fewer than 20 were stationed at New Madrid, and fewer than 100 at St. Louis, and that's when everybody was not sick or wounded. Without more troops, the United States could in no way force the Osage even to consider Jefferson's plan for them. This is two of the buffalo robes that the congressman mentioned. The United States government had a bit more of a chance with the Quapaws, whose 3 towns in 1803 lay between the Osage, up the Arkansas River, and the Arkansas Post at its mouth. Quapaw men fished in the region's streams and hunted ducks and turkeys, and beaver and rabbits, deer and bear in the forests and meadows around here. Like Osage women, Quapaw women grew squash and beans and, of course, corn, sunflowers. Quapaw women had fruit trees and nut trees that they had cultivated. They had domestic fowl by this point. The Quapaws had fewer than 1,000 people by the early 1800s, and they needed to establish a relationship with the United States similar to what they had had with France and with Spain. What the Quapaws told U.S. officials who came was that you need to do what France and Spain did. You need to abide by the treaty and take up the responsibilities of the previous empires that were here. You need to negotiate with us regularly. You need to give us annual presents, basically as payment for being allowed to have Arkansas Post on our land. And you need to help protect us against the Osage, and white settlers, anybody who might try to take our land from us, Indian or white. United States officials instead said, no, wait, we're in charge of this relationship, and the goal is civilization. You civilize first, and then we'll talk about goods and assistance and all these other things. So while the Arkansas Osage ignored the American model of civilization and continued to negotiate through armed strength, the Quapaws said, we're already what you want us to be. We're already a settled agricultural people. Quapaw leaders told local official John Treat, we find it extraordinary that the United States was neglecting them. They said, given the wish of the present father, Jefferson, that we should endeavor to place less dependence on the chase and become accustomed to cultivating the soil. They said, if Jefferson paid any attention to us, he would see we already do it to that extent, as enables a supply to many of the inhabitants here, both of corn and of horses. They said, not only do we farm, we do the farming here. People eat the corn that our women produced. John Treat recognized the Quapaws' point. He could see what was around him, but he didn't quite see its irony. He wrote to the Secretary of War, the Quapaws present to us the fairest prospect of civilization of any Indian tribes. Basically said, so they're somewhere between civilized and savage. Sure, they raise corn, they sell horses, but they still get most of their meat from the hunt. And Quapaw men didn't farm. 19th century white Americans just couldn't see Quapaw women as yeoman farmers producing for the market, which is what they were, right? Instead, they would say, women need to learn the use of the needle, the spinning wheel, the loom, and all kinds of domestic manufactures common in civilized families. Got to do it our way. Now, there was another group who arrived in the early years of the Louisiana Purchase. The Osage and the Quapaws had been here a long time. But the Cherokees who came to Arkansas in these years fit Jefferson's conceptions of civilization even better. Between the beginning of between 1803 and 1828, around 6,000 Cherokees from Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee immigrated to Arkansas to get away from these pressures in the East that Jefferson had identified. And Jefferson heartily approved. This was part of his plan. But of course, when the Cherokees came, they moved on to Quapaw and Osage land. You can see where they are here on this. Yeah, Cherokees there. So the Quapaws, the Cherokees were able to make an agreement with the Quapaws. The Quapaws said, if you want to live between us and the Osage, that sounds fantastic. You are welcome to that. The Osage certainly saw it differently. The Cherokees ended up fighting a war against the Osage. They argued to the United States that they, the Cherokees, deserved the land because they were more civilized than the Osage, using Jefferson's terms. And Cherokee leaders emphasized their similarities to white Americans. One Cherokee chief named Thomas Graves, he impressed Major Stephen Long when he visited the region, with his fine house, as Long wrote, surrounded with enclosed fields of corn, cotton, and sweet potatoes, with cribs, sheds, droves of swine, flocks of geese, and all the usual accompaniments of a thriving settlement. Long referred to the Cherokees here in Arkansas as almost exclusively agriculturalists. Now, the Cherokees really weren't living that differently from the Quapaws, but Long saw it differently. So the Quapaws lived in multifamily houses covered in bark that looked different from what Long thought houses should look like. The women farmed fields in common. Cherokee chiefs, on the other hand, the ones that Long visited, this chief lived in a frame house, which was quite impressive. They had enclosed fields and livestock. Long also noted the neatly tended domestic animals that the Cherokee chief had, and he actually compared them to poor white settlers who were beginning to come to Arkansas, who, he said, they would just bring pigs, they'd set them out, and then they'd go hunt their own pigs. You know, that was the way they had their livestock. He was much more impressed with the Cherokee chief. So, Arkansas Cherokees and poor white settlers really defied this dichotomy of savage Indians and civilized white people. And the Cherokees took advantage of this. They claimed that as a civilized people, they were a natural friend of the United States. But they also threatened to be a dangerous enemy if they were provoked. In 1813, 33 Arkansas Cherokees wrote to the governor of Missouri to report that there had been thefts by white bandits on some of their property. Like the Quapaws, the Cherokees emphasized their own agriculture as qualifying them for protection from the United States. These Cherokees wrote, "We are endeavoring to cultivate the soil for our support, but unfortunately, there are a few bad men combined together for the purpose of stealing our property, and thereby preventing us from pursuing our farms." They told the governor, some of these characters have solicited us to join them in killing, robbing, and burning the houses of the honest and industrious parts of the white inhabitants. So basically, using all of Jefferson's code words, right? We're farming, we're trying to farm, that's why we're here. These bad white people are making it more difficult, but they're also asking us to join them against the good white people, so that's two reasons you should help us, right? Arkansas Cherokees also held themselves up as more civilized than other Indians, and especially against the Osage. In the war against the Osage, the Cherokees portrayed themselves as the innocent victims, even though they had moved onto lands that the Osage saw as their own. Cherokees leaders argued, we're implementing Jefferson's civilization policy, and they are impeding it. It's an easy choice to be on our side. One group of Cherokee leaders wrote, "For 9 years we've been trying to make friends with the Osage, but they just keep fighting us." The chief said, "We are trying to live the way Jefferson advised, to raise our crops for the support of our families. Only when provoked beyond bearing," they wrote, had they taken up arms in a defensive war against these wild Indians. The Cherokees continued to claim self-defense through the whole war, despite the fact that they had settled on Osage land, and that they attacked the Osage as often as the Osage attacked them. One Cherokee chief put it, "Our people have been most inhumanly murdered, butchered, and plundered by a band of savages," using that language of savages against other Indians, Indian enemies. Ultimately, white American settlers would develop their own arguments for the land based on the claim that they, only white people, could be civilized people. And unlike Jefferson, eventually these Americans in the 1820s and 30s, they would cast the civilization-savage dichotomy in racial terms, terms that they thought Indians could not cross. By the 1810s, some white citizens of Arkansas were already arguing that Congress shouldn't let Indians have any land at all. One petition accused Congress of unnecessarily lavishing large portions of public and private property on savages, while a total indifference is manifested toward their fellow citizen. They put the choice differently. The United States government should support white citizens over any savages. Of course, the Cherokees found this line of reasoning ridiculous. One Cherokee named Nutah-Util, or No Killer, wrote a letter to the editor of the Arkansas Gazette, arguing against this accusation that the Cherokees were too uncivilized to keep their land in Arkansas. He wrote, "What is civilization? Is it a practical knowledge of agriculture? Then I am willing to compare the farms and gardens of this nation, the Cherokee Nation, with those of the mass of the white population in the territory. The advantage will be on our side. Does civilization consist in good and comfortable buildings? Here, if the comparison be made, we shall have the advantage over the mass of your people. Does it consist in morality and religion? Our people have built wholly at their own expense the only meeting house, the only church in the territory. Does it consist in school and the education of youth? I believe that a larger portion of our youths can read and write than of your own settlement." So No Killer identifies the flaws in American reasoning, right? He says, if the federal government wants Indians to civilize, it shouldn't make them leave their farms and their homes and their churches and their schools. If the government wanted only civilized people here, it should maybe move the Osage. Maybe it should move some white people, but it should certainly leave the Cherokees. By all the standards that Anglo-American leaders had cited in the past, the Cherokees deserved their place in the United States. Of course, it wouldn't work out that way. Jefferson's vision would be replaced by forced Indian removal, as we'll talk about more later today. But of course, also, Quapaws, Osage, and Cherokees would continue to live in this region and remain their own nations, even under the extreme pressures of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Which seems like a good time to stop and recognize that we are on historic Quapaw land, and to thank the Quapaw tribe for helping to fund the fusion programs. So I think I have time for a couple questions if anybody has them.
Great, thank you so much. We do have time for questions and answers. Please raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you.
Okay, so I know you have questions, you just haven't thought of them yet. In just a little while, I'm going to tell you what to do with the Post-its that are at your table, and it's going to be those questions that you haven't thought of yet. Oh, wait, we do actually have a question in the back of the room. I'm coming that way. Yes, ma'am.
At the time that the Cherokees were writing and asking the government to let them stay, obviously they were literate. What about the Quapaws and the Osage? Were they also at this time?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So no, the Quapaws and the Osage, I don't think any of them were writing at the time, although they had for quite some time had people living with them, some of whom were arguably Quapaw, who could write and would write down what the chiefs said. So none of the chiefs who wrote from, official letters from the Osage or the Quapaws, as far as I know, were writing themselves. But they had people who basically worked for them, whose job was to write down what they said. Now, the Cherokees, one of the things about what they're saying here is they're making this claim for all of the Arkansas Cherokees. Most Arkansas Cherokees also couldn't read or write, but the leaders could, and they sort of portrayed themselves as everybody works like that. Everybody is,
George, are you yawning or is that a question? Okay. I couldn't tell.
Can you talk about the degree of unity or the degree of factionalism that existed within the Arkansas Cherokees? And obviously, they are a separate faction from the Eastern Cherokees.
Right, yeah. So there could be certainly a whole talk on kind of internal politics within the Cherokees. At this point, I think most of the people who have moved already are sort of agree on who their leaders are and what their policy is here to take up these Arkansas lands and to argue for them and to fight against the Osage. On the other hand, there are plenty of people back in Cherokee country in the East who think they should never have left, that that's giving in to U.S. demands, that more Cherokees believe in the early 1800s that the best policy is staying where they are, showing these very same things in the East, that they farm and that they have a newspaper and they have courts and all these things they're developing in the East to both to sort of move into the 19th century as a nation and to show the United States that they're a nation. So to some of them, by even moving west, some of these people are sellouts. And so when most of them are from the East are forcibly removed, when the United States government forcibly removes most of them in the 1830s, some of that tension is the root of the assassinations and other things that happen within the Cherokee Nation in those early years in Oklahoma.
All right, any more questions? All right, thank you so much, Dr. DuVal. That was
Thank you.
fantastic.